Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski. I'm talking to Jeff Snider, Head of Global Research for Alhambra Partners. Jeff, we're going to discuss an article that got posted on January 22nd for Real Clear Markets, and it was called, "They Can't See the Dire Economic Situation for What It Really Is." Did I get that title right?
You got the title right. That's absolutely correct.
That's all I'm here for, just the title. And I'm going to leave the rest up to you. Jeff, what did you write about?
Well, we're talking about the long depression and the Gilded Age and inequality and all sorts of labor market upset and upheaval. And really a story about where did the modern unemployment rate come from? And it really came out of essentially struggling to understand not just unemployment, but what were these industrial depressions that for the first time had become a widespread significant phenomenon across the entire country, not just the country, but at that time around the rest of the industrialized world. These were relatively new to human experience, and the one in the 1870s, that began in the 1870s, was something that just kind of lingered on for a very long time, which is why the term Gilded Age itself has such a pejorative negative connotation with it, because it represented an era where if you did well, you did really well, but what about everybody else who didn't? And the numbers of people who didn't experience the kind of advance in societal progress were just indeed way too much, way too large.
And obviously the audience can hear and see the connection immediately to our time right now. It reads as if we were talking about the 21st century. Jeff, you introduce us to a man named Samuel Gompers, and you say that he was one of the most important, if not the most important, figures in American labor. Who was he? What did he do? And tell us about this 1873 to 1878 period, which, as you note, was the longest downturn in American history.
Yeah, in terms of time, it was, even now the NBR says it was 65 months peak to trough, which is, 65 months is more than 5 years, which is an unbelievable level of economic contraction to take place. And it wasn't all contraction, but it was lack of recovery up until that point. Any even modest rebound had been absent. And what that meant was, Samuel Gompers' experience was unbelievable economic misery. And I think one of the charitable groups in New York City said, well, it might be as much as a quarter of all workers in New York City were unemployed, and therefore, they were running around with nothing to do, creating all sorts of social problems, societal problems, in which led Gompers in later years, a decade later, to basically kick off the American labor movement with the creation of the American Federation of Labor in 1886. But it was really about his experience during this long depression where, unemployment was widespread. It was not just in New York City, it was everywhere. And not more than that, it didn't seem like you could escape it. We had no idea where it came from. Most people didn't have any idea what was going on. And it just seemed like this massive economic disease had befouled the entire country. And not just the entire country, but the entire industrialized world. And so it was a recipe for all sorts of social upheaval, because widespread misery that didn't seem to ever want to end, and no explanation for what was going on.
You mentioned that the words tramp and bum came into use at that time. And then there's also a moment here when you detail how Gompers was talking about a friend of his who, during that misery, during the winter of 1876, was forced to eat the family dog.
Yeah, and that's, the term tramp and bum were initially used to refer to these large groups of Civil War veterans who would simply, go from place to place as a group and camp, camp to try to get some kind of mostly private relief, but also to agitate for government relief too, because they didn't know what else to do. Again, this was a new phenomenon for them to experience, and nobody really had any answers. And what they kept finding is nobody else had any answers either. And it was just a recipe for all sorts of social upheaval, as well as creating the conditions for why this particular industrial depression would be remembered as the long depression, because it didn't seem to want to ever go away.
Well, there was someone who thought it wasn't as bad as it was being made out to be, and that maybe Gompers was exaggerating. Can you tell us a little bit about Carroll D. Wright?
Well, Carroll Wright, he knew this was a disaster, but what he was really interested in was saying, look, if we want to figure this thing out, we need to be honest about what's really going on. And at the time, it was quite natural for labor leaders like Gompers, or what Gompers would become, to essentially say, look, this is really bad, and inflate the negative numbers so as to make his case better. Labor agitation often used, ridiculous statistics to try to say, look, the entire system needs to be rewritten because it's that bad. And what Carroll Wright said was, well, we don't really know how bad it is, so let's figure this out. And so he was appointed the successor for the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics, which was the first in the nation. And he inaugurated what became what we were familiar with today as the current employment survey, essentially. He surveyed town assessors and said, look, go out and count the number of unemployed people in your town and report back to me what the number actually is. And what they found out was the common statistics cited at the time, which was just a wild guess, was that there had been 3 million unemployed Americans in, I think it was 1876, which was sort of the depths of the Depression, which in terms of percentage would have rivaled the 1930s. It would have been that bad, a really long and deep depression. And a quarter million of those were thought to live in Massachusetts alone, which is where Carroll Wright was working. But in his initial survey, he only found 22,000. So he said, look, yeah, this is a problem, but it may not be as big a problem as it seems. And what he did was he created the method by which we do the modern unemployment rate, where it actually comes from. He said, we're going to categorize workers not just as, are you employed or are you unemployed, but why are you unemployed? Why aren't you working? Is it because you're not looking for work? Is it because you don't think you can find a job at the wage rate you want to receive? And so he kind of started to classify so that he could understand what was really going on in the economy, and especially the role that wages were playing in the unemployment.
And then you're quoting from several sources here, and in one of them you're making the point about diminishing profits of many industries conducted with little or no margin to those managing them. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the quote that you just used, Emil, is from what became the Bureau of Labor, which is the National Bureau of Labor's first annual report. Because as the Depression lingered on into the 1880s, Chester A. Arthur's administration, along with Congress, decided we got to do something about this unemployment problem. And so they gave Carroll Wright the job as the first director of the National Bureau of Labor, which was then housed under the Department of Interior, and said, hey, figure out this depression stuff for us because we don't know what the hell's going on, and it doesn't seem to be going away. This is the middle 1880s now. And so the Bureau of Labor put out their first annual report, which is an amazing report, stocked full of all sorts of tables and data of really fine detail, all the kinds of things that you can't get, about the 1830s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And they really made an honest effort to figure out these quote unquote industrial depressions. Where did they come from? Why did they last? What was really going on? And what they said was, look, in one sense, it's not as bad as people make it out to be. It's not like the economy just collapsed and just went to zero. Everything just zeroed out and everything stopped. That's not what really this depression has been. It's that we suffered a shock, we suffered a setback. Shock is a modern term, but they said we suffered a setback, and then we could never get out of it. We could never get a recovery out of it. It was an unstable situation because we could never really get that kind of economic growth that we had before the 1873 bank panic. And that was the other thing, right? Where did the initial problem come from? Where was that inflection? It was in the panic of 1873, which in the United States had to do with railroad overbuilding and Jay Cook's failure. But there was also an international component with the failure in Vienna and across the rest of the industrialized world too. But by and large, what they said was, we looked at all the data, there was deflation, but it didn't lead to a complete collapse of the entire system. What it did was it robbed us of an upside. The American economy did gangbusters in the middle of the 19th century. We had this bank panic in 1873, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't that it contracted from there, is that there was a lack of growth from there. We had no upside to look forward to and therefore absorb these however many unemployed that there are throughout the country.
But the long depression would last even beyond when that report was written. Isn't that right? When was the report actually finished?
The first annual report was written in 1886. And by some people's definitions, the long depression didn't end until 1896. So it was a 20-year period. Again, and I think that's one reason why it's not really well recognized, is because it doesn't conform to our thought of what does the depression look like. Everybody thinks the depression is 1929, 1930, 1931, where things are just collapsing at an unbelievable rate, and it doesn't look like anything. It looks like the world is ending. That's not really what a depression is. A depression is a prolonged period of, at times, stagnation. It's where we can't seem to get growth that we used to take for granted. And so, lots of people have put forward explanations for what happened in the 1870s, but what we know for sure is that it started with the usual bank panic monetary interruption, and therefore gave off these deflationary symptoms, which persisted for very long periods of time. And talking about, what we talked about last time with the bond bubble, the best fundamentals for high prices of the safest, most liquid instruments. It was a prolonged period of, at best, stagnation that was punctuated by ups and downs, contractions and what seemed like recoveries, but the recoveries that never went anywhere.
I've been really recently enjoying a book by Richard Vague called A Brief History of Doom. I finished it, and basically it's a tour of 43 financial crises in the 6 largest economies over the last 200 years. And that's absolutely right. So there's the crisis of 1873 in the United States and the rest of the world, at least the advanced economies. But then it would continue. There would be another one in 1882 that touched off in France. Then it showed up in Japan, same year, 1882. In the United States, and you had the 1884 crisis that began, and I believe it lasted for 3 years until 1887. That one was terrible. And then you had another one, 1893. And then the 1893 one was perhaps, it was as terrible as, how you said the 1873 crisis lasted 65 months, at least by one account. The 1893 crisis was the deepest one. So it's just this one after another. And I remember, and here it comes up in this book, that Coxey's Army came into being, which was a group of unemployed that started out as 100 men in Ohio and grew to 500 by the time it reached Washington. Another source says that it was several thousand that were camped outside of Washington, and that the organizers were arrested. It seems so similar to what happened recently in the Capitol. And in fact, there were more people on their way to Washington. One group commandeered a train on their way to Washington, and federal agents had to beat them and throw them out. And this was 1 year before the Pullman crisis, the big confrontation in Pullman that we've discussed before. So, was it a depression like the way we think of in the 1930s, or perhaps the silent one that we're living through now? I don't know, economically speaking, if the data matches, but it seems like there are so many similar sounding events that took place.
Yeah, and I think it's our modern mind has colored by the post-war economy, which only experiences recession, which is different. We think of a contraction as a temporary deviation from otherwise unbroken potential. Milton Friedman's plucking model, for example, and that's not really what we have observed throughout the global economy since 2008. It has been the opposite. It has been very much like a long depression, right? It's not that the economy's collapsed and went to zero, continue minus a sea of minus signs forever forward. That's not been the case at all. GDP has been positive and it hits record levels, but the rate of growth has changed. It's changed substantially to the point where there's been the last 13 years have been characterized by the lack of upside. We have an economic inflection at a global dollar financial panic, and following it, we have this unstable economy, intermittent crises, and a lack of upside throughout the rest of the economy, which meets the certainly the definitions that were put forward by the first annual report of the Bureau of Labor under Carroll Wright, which is that it's not a recession. It's a prolonged change, a prolonged serious change that is, in some ways even worse and more hideous and insipid.
And it's not only an economic one, according to Wright's report. He said that an industrial depression is a mental and moral malady, which sounds absolutely correct. And it reminds me of what we heard in Japan about trying to break the depressionary mindset. And as you make the point, it sounds like something straight out of J. Powell and the modern day economic thinking.
Yeah, which is that we need to focus on emotion and sentiment. We need to break people of their negative thoughts in order to get them thinking, what John Maynard Keynes called, animal spirits, right? It's all about risk taking, and that's true. It's absolutely true. They observed it right up close during the Long Depression that there was an emotional component to all these things. But why do people develop these negative emotions? Where do they come from? Where are these restraining feelings and sentiments? Where do they derive from? And what Carroll Wright said, and what most people realize today, is that, look, when you have uncertainty and instability, those combined are the ingredients for this, as they said in Japan, this deflationary mindset to take hold and can continue. It really goes back to uncertainty and instability. And so the answer that, some of the answers that put forward in the first annual report by the Bureau of Labor, as well as what we hear about today, are somewhat wrong. It's like, quantitative easing, money printing, getting moral suasion about inflation. These are not answers for instability. They don't create stability. They create what they think is the opposite force of instability that seems to be more helpful. And so, even from the most basic level, even if you give the Federal Reserve and governments credit for what they're doing, it may not be the right thing just from the fact that they're not trying to foster an environment of stability. They're trying to fight one form of instability with another. And that, I think the results speak for themselves because they don't even pass the smell test.
Well, Jeff, before we wrap up your Real Clear Markets essay, I wanted to share with you and the audience a few graphs that I had just recently completed where I compared real GDP per capita to the Long Depression and the Great Depression to present day. So let me pull that up right now. So what I'm showing for the audience that's listening only is I've got a graph, and the y-axis is an index of 100, and 100 represents the year before the depression started, our three depressions. And then along the bottom, I've got, along the x-axis, I've got each year. So, let's talk about our silent depression. 2006 would be year 0. 2007 is the year it began. That would be year 1 on these graphs. And then I've got a graph of basically real GDP per capita for 28 countries. I've only got 16 up here, but I'm just going to go through a few of them. And basically what we see is that right now we're in year 2020. That's 14 years on the graph here. We're in year 14. And the question is, where do we find ourselves in year 14 in the silent depression compared to the Great Depression and then the Long Depression? And if we weren't in a depression, then we should be well clear of where real GDP per capita was in those previous definite depressions. And so the first one I'm showing
Emil,
here.
The most striking part of that graph is not where we are now, but where we were the year before. I mean, you could blame the current drop in GDP on COVID and that kind of thing, but you can see even before we got to 2020 how we were languishing behind both of these previous depressions. And that's really, I think, the point, is that this is not a 2020 thing. This is not a COVID thing. This is something that's been going on for a very long time.
That's right. And we were looking at Britain right there. But I'll do the spoiler here. Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia, they're all below both depressions right now as of 2020, but they were there in 2019 as well. And even if they weren't, they're right in the middle. They're part of this depressionary eras. It's a great comparison. We can look at Brazil. Brazil is one country that's doing, quote unquote, better than the other two depressions, or at least it had been up till 2014.
But not enough better, right?
Yeah,
That's the other thing.
Yeah, and it doesn't look good for next year. It
Yeah.
doesn't look good. And then we can look at Japan. And of course, with Japan, you've got the whole World War II thing happening with the Great Depression. But Japan is doing worse than both depressions, both previous two depressions. You can go to Portugal. You can go to South Africa, Chile, Greece. And, you know, there's different stories for the European countries, depending on which one was involved and what side during World War II. But look at Finland. Finland had a pretty good Great Depression after the first couple of years were over. The Long Depression wasn't too bad for Finland. But holy cow, the Silent Depression is an absolute disaster. They're at the same point they were 14 years ago. There's Germany, Sweden, Romania. If anyone wants Sri Lanka, just let me know. I've got that one too. I know, I can't believe why Sri Lanka. There's all these countries that should have data, but not all of them have data going back to the 1870s. Sri Lanka is one of them that does. I can't believe. Oh, I guess it's because of the British.
Yeah.
Jeff,
well, look, our point here is that it's not that we're in a Great Depression or we're in the Long Depression. Is that what's going on today looks too much like them and not enough unlike them. We're not experiencing the upside that we have taken for granted up until 2008. And I argue in the article that it's even worse than that because people have gotten this false sense of euphoria. They even think that the economy has been booming, especially in the United States, that things have been really good. Look at the unemployment rate, it's really low.
the stock
So not
market,
only do we
Jeff,
have, what's that?
our last president, President Trump, it was the first or second thing on the Council of Economic Advisors website. The first was either employment, or if it wasn't, it was the stock market that was listed first. It's up. The unemployment rate is down. Boom. The best.
Yeah, this false impression of how things are going. And I think that, again, going back to the 1870s and the Gilded Age, why there was so much misery and so much dissatisfaction, political and social upheaval, because they didn't have answers. And that rings true to today, too, because, again, most people are sort of unaware of the kind of condition that we associate with. We're associated with depressions. We're associated with a lack of upside, an unstable system that can go on for a very, very long time. I think that's the overriding point by comparing with these other periods in history, is that they can go on a lot longer than you think they can. You know, if we think about only recessions, which are very short and temporary, that's the difference. That's really the difference here, is that this is not a recession. 2008, the Great Recession, was not a Great Recession at all. It was an inflection point that kicked off an era of lack of upside.
You know who does have upside, Jeff? And that's the country that we're going to discuss next in part 2 of this episode, and that's China. It may be the only country, or at least the largest country, a large country, perhaps some countries in Africa, didn't have a downturn at all in 2020. China, its GDP has grown year over year. That's unlike any other country that's a large economy. And maybe they're doing it right. So let's talk about them in part 2. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and we're going to talk to Jeff Snider, Head of Global Research at Alhambra Partners. Jeff, we're going to discuss the article that you posted on January 22nd. You didn't post it. You submitted it to Real Clear Markets. And what was it called? They keep discussing. Oh, no, I forgot what it was called.
So did I.